Gender inequality is one of those topics that almost everyone has an opinion about, but very few people talk about honestly from their own actual experience. Most discussions about it stay at the level of statistics, policies, and political arguments. Today, I want to do something different. I want to talk about what I have personally observed, what I have experienced directly, what my students from Japan and South Korea have shared with me over the years, and how the Philippines compares to those countries when it comes to how women are treated, seen, and given opportunity. I am going to be honest, including about the times I am not sure whether something I experienced was actually about gender or about something else entirely. That kind of honesty feels more useful to me than pretending I have everything figured out. Let me start with the Philippines, because that is where I live and where I have the most direct experience. One of the things that genuinely surprises people who do not know the Philippines well is how visible women are in positions of authority here. This is not something I say to suggest that gender inequality does not exist in my country, because it absolutely does. But compared to Japan and South Korea, the contrast in certain areas is significant and worth acknowledging honestly. The Philippines has had two female presidents. Corazon Aquino, who came to power after the fall of the Marcos dictatorship in 1986, is one of the most recognized political figures in modern Philippine history. She was not a career politician before becoming president. She was a widow whose husband, Benigno Aquino Jr., was assassinated, and the outpouring of public support after his death became the foundation of a movement that changed the course of the country. Gloria Macapagal Arroyo came later, serving as president for most of the 2000s. She was the daughter of a former president, Diosdado Macapagal, making the Macapagal Arroyo family one of the Philippines' notable political dynasties with female leadership at its center. The country has also had multiple female vice presidents throughout its history. Women are represented across various levels of government, from senators and congressional representatives down to governors, mayors, city councilors, and even officials at the barangay level, which is the smallest administrative unit in the Philippine system, roughly equivalent to a village or neighborhood. Seeing a female barangay captain or a female city mayor is common enough in the Philippines that it does not generate surprise the way it might in some other countries. In the workforce more broadly, women in the Philippines are a significant and visible presence. The business process outsourcing industry, which includes call centers and back-office operations, is one of the largest employment sectors in the country, and women make up a substantial portion of both the workforce and the management levels within it. Female supervisors, operations managers, and account managers are common. Female senior leaders are less common, but certainly not unheard of. When I worked in that industry, I had female supervisors, worked alongside female colleagues at every level, and did not experience the feeling that being a woman was an automatic ceiling on advancement. Single mothers in that industry are treated with the same professional expectations as anyone else. Whether someone has children, is raising them alone, or has a complicated personal life is generally considered separate from their professional competence, at least in the more structured environments I was part of. Promotion tends to follow performance and, honestly, connections, but those connections are not exclusively male in the way they might be in more rigidly patriarchal environments. I want to be careful here, because saying that women are visible in leadership in the Philippines is not the same as saying gender inequality does not exist. It does. Domestic violence remains a serious problem. Women in informal labor sectors, including domestic workers and agricultural workers, face significant disadvantages in pay, legal protection, and access to benefits. Sexual harassment is common and underreported. The burden of unpaid domestic labor falls disproportionately on women even when they are also working full-time outside the home. The Catholic Church's historical influence on reproductive health policy has had lasting effects on women's access to family planning services and information. These are real issues, and they deserve honest acknowledgement. But when I compare the Philippines to Japan specifically, the contrast in formal professional and political representation is stark enough to be worth discussing carefully. Japan is one of the world's most economically advanced nations. Its technology, infrastructure, cultural output, and standard of living are globally recognized. And yet, when it comes to gender equality in professional and political life, Japan consistently ranks very low compared to other wealthy countries. The World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report has placed Japan near the bottom of its ranking among high-income nations for years, particularly in the categories of economic participation and political empowerment. For a long time, Japan had never had a female prime minister. The country recently took a significant step in this direction, which marked a meaningful moment in Japanese political history. But it remains notable that this milestone came so late compared to many other countries at similar levels of economic development. The reasons for this are connected to deep structural and cultural factors that do not change quickly. In many Japanese workplaces, particularly in traditional corporate environments, there is an expectation that employees will demonstrate dedication through long working hours and near total availability to the company. This culture of overwork is well documented and has its own specific term in Japanese, karoshi, which refers to death from overwork, a phenomenon serious enough to have generated dedicated government attention and public health discussion. Within this environment, women who become mothers often face an impossible choice. Continue working at the pace the corporate culture demands, which is extremely difficult to reconcile with primary caregiving responsibilities, or step back from full-time work, which often means stepping back from the promotion track permanently. The assumption that women will naturally take on the primary caregiving role, manage the household, and organize family life, while men focus on their careers, is still deeply embedded in many parts of Japanese society. It is not universal, and younger generations in Japan are navigating these expectations differently than their parents did. But the structure of workplaces, the limited availability of affordable childcare, the school schedules that assume a parent who is available during the day, and the social expectations around what a good mother looks like, all of these create a system that makes it genuinely difficult for women to maintain career momentum after having children. I have had conversations with Japanese students about this, and what strikes me most is how quietly the weight of it is carried. Japanese culture does not generally encourage direct complaint or public expression of frustration about systemic issues. So the dissatisfaction often comes through in small comments, in the way someone describes their daily schedule, in the tiredness in how they talk about balancing everything. The students I have spoken with who are working mothers describe lives that are genuinely exhausting, not because they are personally incapable, but because the system was not designed with their full participation in mind. The 4B movement in South Korea, which I discussed in a separate video, is partly a response to this same dynamic playing out in a Korean context. South Korean women have increasingly named the specific costs of trying to participate fully in a society that simultaneously expects them to perform at the highest professional level while also bearing the primary weight of marriage, childbearing, and household management. The movement's decision to opt out of those structures entirely is extreme, but the frustrations it expresses are not difficult to understand when you look at what the data says about gender pay gaps, promotion rates, and the distribution of domestic labor in South Korea. A student I spoke with once raised a question about quota systems for women in government, specifically whether the Philippines has policies that reserve a certain percentage of political positions for women. It was a genuinely interesting question, and thinking through my answer helped me clarify my own thinking on the issue. Quota systems, for those unfamiliar with the concept, are policies that require a certain percentage of positions, whether in government, corporate boards, or other institutions, to be filled by women or by members of underrepresented groups. They exist in various forms in many countries, and the arguments for and against them are real on both sides. My honest view is that a quota is only as good as the pool of qualified candidates available to fill it. If you set a requirement that 50% of Senate seats must be held by women, but there are not enough women running who have the experience, preparation, and electoral support to fill those seats, you end up in a situation where the quota gets met by assigning people to positions they are not ready for, which does not serve the people those positions are supposed to represent. Genuine gender equality in leadership comes from creating the conditions under which qualified women can develop, run, and win, not just from mandating numbers. That said, quota systems have worked effectively in some contexts, particularly when they are implemented alongside other structural changes that actually make it possible for women to participate. A quota, without childcare support, without equal pay enforcement, without legal protection from harassment, and without cultural shifts in how leadership is perceived, is a symbolic gesture rather than a structural solution. Now, I want to tell you something more personal, because I think it matters for how I understand all of this. My most vivid memory of something that felt like gender discrimination happened when I was in 5th grade. There was a speech competition at my school. The speech was José Rizal's Mi Último Adiós, which is Rizal's famous farewell poem written on the eve of his execution. It is a powerful piece of writing, and performing it requires real skill. My teacher narrowed the candidates down to 2 students. Me and a boy who was shorter than most of our classmates, from a family with political connections in the area. I had enjoyed speech competitions at the schools I attended before transferring to that one. I was confident in what I could do, but my teacher chose him. At the time, I thought about a few possible reasons. The poem was written by a man. The boy was short, which meant that dressed in period costume, he would look more like Rizal physically. His family had connections that mine did not. Or maybe the teacher simply thought he was the better choice. I was young and I processed it as probably unfair, but I moved on. What happened next is something I still think about with a complicated mix of feelings. He won at the school level. He went on to represent our school at the city competition. And he won at the city level too. So clearly, he was genuinely talented. When he went on to the district level competition, which involved representatives from multiple cities, he placed second. First place went to a girl from another school. I tell this story not to claim that I would have won if I had been given the chance, because I genuinely do not know that. I tell it because it captures something real about how these moments work. A decision is made, you are left wondering whether it was fair or not, and then life moves on, and you never get a clean answer. That ambiguity is actually very common in experiences of gender discrimination. It is rarely clear-cut. It is rarely something you can point to definitively and say, that happened specifically because I am a woman. It is usually layered with other factors, other relationships, other dynamics, and you are left carrying the uncertainty. The bullying I experienced in high school also had almost nothing to do with gender. It had to do with being a transferee in a new school, being seen as different, refusing a leadership role that my classmates wanted me to take, and the dynamics that emerge in any group of teenagers when someone does not fit neatly into the existing social order. One of the students involved in excluding me later apologized to me sincerely before she passed away at a very young age. I accepted that apology without bitterness, and I still feel that way. People do things as teenagers that they would not do as adults, and the grace to acknowledge that and say sorry is something worth honoring when it happens. The call center industry brought me into contact with misogyny in a form that was clearer and less ambiguous. There were customers who did not want to speak to a woman about technical issues. There were customers who assumed that a woman's knowledge was automatically inferior. There were customers who, when they found out they were speaking to someone in the Philippines, added layers of condescension about accent and competence that were about both gender and nationality simultaneously. I handled those calls. I did my job. I did not internalize those customers' limitations as truths about my own capability. But they were real, and they happened regularly enough to be a recognizable pattern rather than isolated incidents. There was one supervisor early in my career who seemed to hold me to a different standard than she held the male employees around me. I noticed it. I did not fully understand it at the time. Later I came to think that not everything that feels like gender discrimination actually is. Sometimes it is personal dislike. Sometimes it is office politics. Sometimes it is a complicated mix of factors that does not reduce cleanly to one explanation. I try to hold that complexity rather than defaulting to the simplest narrative. What I have come to believe, based on my own experience and the conversations I have had with students from Japan, South Korea, and other places, is that gender inequality is real. It is structural. It is not the same everywhere, and it cannot be understood without understanding the specific cultural, historical, and economic context of each place. The Philippines has made genuine progress in some areas, particularly in political representation and workforce participation. Japan is grappling with a system that has historically worked against women's full participation in professional life, and there are real signs of generational change even if the pace is slow. South Korea is dealing with tensions between rapid modernization, deeply embedded traditional expectations, and a younger generation of women who are saying out loud that the current arrangement is not working for them. None of these countries have figured it out. Neither has any other country. But honest conversations about what is actually happening, conversations that include personal stories alongside broader observations, feel more useful to me than the kind of discussion that stays entirely at the level of policy and statistics. This is my honest account of what I have seen, experienced, and thought about when it comes to gender inequality. It is incomplete, because one person's experience always is. But it is mine, and that is the basis from which I always start. Thanks for watching. If this conversation resonated with you, please consider hitting the subscribe button. I am currently working toward my goal of 1,000 subscribers, so I can finally monetize this channel and turn this passion into a sustainable part of my future. This is my unfiltered diary of solo living in the Philippines, from the long days in the ESL classroom to my journey as a beginner learning Japanese and Korean. Your support helps me build my retirement fund and keeps this channel growing. If you would like to help out even more, you can check out the Buy a Treat for My Pets link in the description. My dogs definitely appreciate the love. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the next update. Thank you for being such an important part of this journey. I will see you in the next one.